My paternal grandfather was the only federal judge in Lincoln, Nebraska, the capital city of Nebraska. And he was a brilliant man. He got ahead like Abe Lincoln, educated himself. If you start life that poor and make your own way, which my grandfather did, you're quite a fellow. But what he said over and over again to his grandchildren, including my mother, was the real opportunities that come to you are few. And when you get a Lollapalooza, for God's sakes, don't hang by like a timid little rabbit. Don't hang back. He never took a drop of liquor in his whole life. Somebody asked him once, why don't you drink? And he says, why would I take money out of my pocket and put something in my mouth that would make my head work less well? And in the end, he says, whatever else happens, you'll be a man, my son. Why not take these opportunities, the hardships and so forth, to make a man of yourself?
One of the most honorable and successful characters Charlie Munger ever known in his long life was his grandfather, Judge Munger. He was the individual that Charlie Munger looked up to because of the actions Judge Munger performed in 1930s during the Great Depression to help and stabilize the Munger family.
My paternal grandfather was the only federal judge in Lincoln, Nebraska, the capital city of Nebraska. And he'd been there forever, and he stayed there forever after that. I think when he left, he was the longest-serving federal judge in the country. And he was a brilliant man, and he'd risen from nothing. He was the child of two impoverished school teachers. And when he was raised in a little town in Nebraska, they'd give him a nickel to go buy the meat, and he'd go to the butcher shop. He would buy the parts of the animal nobody else would eat. And that's what two school teachers lived on in those days. And the very indignity of it bothered him so much that he just determined to get out of poverty and never go back. And he did. He got ahead like Abe Lincoln, educated himself in lawyers' offices and so on. He had to leave college because he couldn't pay the tuition anymore. But he educated himself, and since he was utterly brilliant, it wasn't all that hard. And he had an attitude that was pretty damned extreme. And I would say his attitude was that you have a moral duty to make yourself as unignorant and as unstupid as you possibly can. And that it was pretty much your highest moral duty. Maybe taking care of your family came first. But in the ranks of moral obligations, quasi-religious, well, yeah, he was conventionally religious, so it may have been a religious duty to him. But he really believed that rationality was a moral duty, and he worked at it, and he scorned people who didn't do it. On the other hand, as a judge, he started with the idea that why would anybody rob a train or whatever, federal crime in those days. And he was pretty hard on people who did it. And I noticed as he got to be older and older and older, he was willing to call a man a good man on easier terms than he started out with. And I think that was a correct development in my... By the way, when he relaxed a little, he was still pretty tough. But he did relax a little, which I thought was appropriate. And I will say something about life generally. I was very lucky in that I had an ancestor that I never met. My mother's grandfather was a pioneer. He came out to Iowa and he lived in a sod house with his young wife. That's a cave through 2 winters. He was a pioneer from nothing. And he rose finally to where he controlled the leading bank in the town and was a very reputable citizen and a very charitable man. He joined Andrew Carnegie and gave the town library to Algona. My grandfather made him do it, my great-grandmother. He never would have done it by himself. And he made him put his giant tarpon in the library as part of the gift. So always amused me to go by that library and see this giant tarpon. So eccentrics come naturally in my family. But at any rate, having wrested this success from hardship and danger and trouble, and he was a captain in the Black Hawk Wars. I mean, he was literally a soldier and part of this. He had this theory, looking back at his long life, with this unusual success. And he owned a bunch of farms at the end that he leased to Germans. Well, you couldn't lose money leasing a farm to a German in Iowa. Naturally, he was successful. But what he said over and over again to his grandchildren, including my mother, was the real opportunities that come to you are few. It's a very fortunate life that is just bathed in opportunity all the way. Most people just get a few times when they can make a huge difference by seizing a huge activity. And he said, when you find one, my dear grandchildren, and you can clearly recognize it, he says, seize it boldly and don't do it small. And my mother, who wasn't interested in finance, but liked to talk transmit the family quirks. But of course, this guy was my soulmate, the great-grandfather I never knew. And of course, I totally adopted his point of view. And I must say it has worked wonderfully. And so I quit claim my great-grandfather Ingham's rule to you. Assume that your really major opportunities in life are going to be few. And when you get a Lollapalooza, for God's sakes, don't hang by like a timid little rabbit. Don't hang back. They aren't that many of the really big good ones. If you take the whole history of Berkshire Hathaway, if you take out the 20 best transactions, our record is a joke. Well, 20 best transactions over 40-some years, that's one every 2 years. And we work at it all the time. Life is not just bathing you in unlimited opportunities, even if you work at being able to find them and seize them.
Charlie Munger quite often talks about the Great Depression, a period in American life that many know about but few actually understand how horrible the conditions actually were. Charlie Munger being alive during that period and seeing his family struggle through it is a great insight into how people tried their best to mitigate the external calamity that fell upon them.
And when the 30s came, one son-in-law was a musician, and of course he couldn't make a living. So my grandfather didn't have that much money, sent him to pharmacy school, carefully picking a profession that couldn't fail, and found him a bankrupt pharmacy to buy and loaned him the money, and my uncle was soon prosperous and remained prosperous the rest of his life. My other uncle had a bank in Stromsburg, Nebraska, but there were 968 people in Stromsburg, and there were 2 national banks. And the capitalization of my uncle's bank was $25,000. And of course, he was a lovely man, but he was an optimist, and a banker should not be an optimist. And when they closed the banks in 1933, the banking examiners came in and they said, you can't reopen. And it was the only business he had. Well, Judge Munger had always saved his money, and he had a lot of good first mortgages on homes occupied by teetotaling German butchers and people he'd carefully pitched. And of course, he never had a default. The houses were in the right neighborhood. The people were sober and hardworking. And so what my grandfather did is take a third of his good mortgages, which is all he had, and put them into the bank and took all the lousy assets out of the bank. So he saved 2 out of 3 of his children, and I thought it was a pretty good thing to do, and very shrewd the way he did it. And he actually got most of his money back 10 or 15 years later out of the lousy assets of the bank when World War II. And that was a good lesson. My grandfather, on the other side, his main business had gone broke in 1922 with all the other wholesale dry goods houses. And what he did, his son-in-law, one of them, went broke, and he cut his house in half and moved that family in. My uncle Fred graduated from the Harvard School of Architecture with great distinction. And in the 20s, he had a very successful architectural practice in Omaha where he did churches and little buildings and houses and so forth, and he made $8,000 or $10,000 a year, which was an enormous amount of money to make from credibly performing the architectural profession in the 1920s. When the 30s came, the architectural permits, building permits in Omaha, would sometimes go down to $30,000 per month for the whole city of Omaha, and some of those were furnace repairs. There was exactly zero work for architects, including my distinguished architect, Uncle Fred. He moved to California, and in California, he took drafting work at low rates for a few architects that still had some work. And when it got worse than that, he went to the county of Los Angeles. And in the agony of the county, they classified him as a laundryman to save money, but had him do drafting work, which after all was exercising his skill. He didn't think it was beneath him. He coped as best he could. He never complained to anybody. His pay after deductions, all through 31, 32, 33, 34, $108.08 per month. Now that wasn't as bad as it seems because he rented a whole house in Glendale for $25 a month. When they created the FHA in 1936, he could take a civil service exam, at which he was first. So for the rest of his life, he was the chief architect for the FHA in Los Angeles, a responsible and interesting and civilization benefiting line of work, and he had a long and happy career doing that. He never got discouraged. He never thought what he had to do was something he should wail about. I never heard him complain about anything. woe is me. Generally speaking, there are two things I've found in my long life one you never do. One is never feel sorry for yourself. If your child is dying of cancer, don't feel sorry for yourself. Never, ever feel sorry for yourself. And the other thing you never want to have is envy. That's the only one of the deadly sins you're never going to have any fun at all. Pick one of the others. And in the end, he says, well, if whatever else happens, you'll be a man, my son. Good message. Good message. Why not take these opportunities, these hardships and so forth, to make a man of yourself? My grandfather Munger had been born in extreme poverty. His two parents were school teachers in a little town in Nebraska, and two school teachers' income enabled him to buy the meat for dinner every night at the butcher shop in the little town he lived in Nebraska. He went to the butcher shop with a nickel, and he bought the parts of the animal nobody else would eat. Now, if you start life that poor and make your own way, which my grandfather did, you're quite a fellow. And he was self-educated, and not self-educated in a rudimentary way. I mean, he spoke Greek and Latin self-educated. I had very interesting people as my examples, and my grandfather Munger believed down to the soles of his feet in being rational, and he worked at it. And I watched it, and of course it worked well for him. It had made him district attorney and president of the Bar Association, and finally a very young federal judge, and he served as the only federal judge in his capital city for almost 40 years. I mean, he had a splendid life. And he always lived way below his income and was able to help other people when they needed help. He was a very good example. And he was kind of firm about it. He never took a drop of liquor in his whole life. Somebody asked him once, why don't you drink? And he says, why would I take money out of my pocket and put something in my mouth that would make my head work less well? Well, you can say why I like my grandfather.